Thank you and welcome to the Washtenaw County Democratic Party, Ann Arbor, 5th Ward, Precinct Delegates Town Hall meeting on affordable housing. All right, so tonight we're gonna have a discussion on affordable housing in Ann Arbor with a little specificity on the 5th Ward. We'll be covering the problem of housing for low-income residents and Ann Arbor's responses to it. Can you all hear me? Okay. The lack of housing that is affordable to moderate to middle income or so-called workforce residents is a growing problem too in the city of Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor is long skewed affluent, but at this point many workers find that they are priced out of the market and are forced to live well outside the city and commute to their jobs. Teachers, hospital and university staff members, and other working professionals find that they are priced out of the market and are forced to live well outside the city and cannot afford to live here. So lack of workforce housing includes renters, but even more so families and those who wish to own their own homes. So we want to examine possible solutions to workforce housing as well as discuss low-income housing. There are also significant social justice issues involved in Ann Arbor's changing housing market. For example, what in recent years has become called Water Hill was for generations known as the West Side, predominantly working class African American neighborhood, contained within the 5th Ward. Water Hill is one of the hottest real estate markets right now, and prices have skyrocketed over the years, pricing out families of moderate or even middle income means, including many older long-term residents. So housing is how we live, and discussion on the subject naturally tends to evoke strong feelings. Housing and housing affordability are big, complex issues. Tonight's town hall is meant to be an open, information-based discussion where we'll all have a chance to learn something, and it would be nice if we could solve all of these problems, or maybe even one of them in 2.5 hours. Short of that, we hope to come away a little bit better informed and to continue what will surely be a long-term conversation on a set of topics that affect us all. All right. First off, I want to thank the organizers of tonight's town hall, Kristen, and excuse my pronunciation, Kristen Severinson, Lisa Petrell, Dan Miknievich, Cheryl Sobliski, Rita Mitchell, Elise Velez, Sarah Harrison for their ideas and hard work, and I want to especially thank Loretta for her inspiration, dedication, and putting it all together. I also would like to acknowledge elected officials in the audience, including Mayor Chris Taylor, and Michigan Democratic Party Secretary Mary Hall Chan. Hopefully I got your name pronounced correctly. If there's any other elected officials in the audience,
Jessica Kelly, Ann Arbor School Board.
All right, thank you, and welcome. All right, so with that, I'd like to introduce tonight's panelists. We have Michael Apple. Is it Apple or Appel?
Apple.
Michael Apple, Senior Developer and HUD Specialist for Avalon Housing. Peter Allen, Developer and Lecturer at the U of M Business School. Teresa Gelati, Executive Director of the Washtenaw County Office of Economic and Community Development. Jennifer Hall, Executive Director of the Ann Arbor Housing Commission. Chip Smith, Council Member representing Ward 5, Ann Arbor City Council. Ali Ramlawi, Council Member representing Ward 5, Ann Arbor City Council. So thank you very much to our esteemed panelists for taking the time to participate tonight and lending their expertise to this conversation. So the format of the town hall will be, we're already running a little bit late, but we're gonna start with a 15-minute educational introduction to affordable housing presented by Teresa Gelati and Jennifer Hall. And then for about an hour, for about 50 minutes, or I'm sorry, for about half an hour, we're gonna have a moderated discussion. I'll be asking questions on affordable housing, and we're going to follow that with a presentation by Peter Allen, and then following that another half hour of moderated questions and discussion on workforce housing. So just a bit on terms, there is no universal definition of affordable housing, and perhaps we'll get into considering the different meanings of the terms in tonight's discussion. But we're breaking our discussion tonight into two parts. Subsidized housing that is affordable to low and very low income individuals and families, and housing that is affordable to those who fall into the moderate to middle income bracket, or so-called workforce housing, and to the best of my knowledge, generally not necessarily subsidized, but If that's not true, we'll learn about it. We're going to begin with the presentation, and thank you very much.
Jennifer and I tend to tag team, so just we'll be flowing back and forth here a little bit. Kind of starting off with a little bit of the terminology. Is that getting louder? Okay, I will. Thank you. Let me know in the back and all of us. A little bit around inequity. We have a lot of pieces of this. Some of it we'll cover in our conversation, and then some of it might be things that we reference when we get to the questions, the panel questions. I'm going to be louder. Okay, I'm going to get this. All right, let's go. So we just got this introduction about what do we talk about when we talk about affordability and affordable housing. So generally when we talk about affordability and what you should be spending on housing, we talk about you shouldn't be spending more than 30% of your gross income on housing. If you're a renter, that includes utilities. If you're a homeowner, that includes your mortgages, taxes, insurance, but no more than 30% of your income. And that's sort of what HUD defines and sort of is sort of a best kind of rule of thumb. But another way to think about it is to also include transportation. So if you put housing and transportation costs together, you should be spending more than 45% of your income on housing. And why that's important is if you live in downtown Ann Arbor, let's say, and you work in downtown Ann Arbor, you can probably spend more on your housing and not need a car. But if you live in a suburb and you're commuting to your job or your school or whatever it might be, you're going to have transportation costs built in. So you have to kind of think about them together. Housing and transportation are so intertwined that we want to make sure that we are thinking about those sort of all connected.
As Stephen mentioned, there's not a universal definition of what affordable housing is as far as maybe the income target. It can include renters and owners. We use the definition that Teresa says, as well as when people talk about workforce housing, we actually consider that to be anybody who's working. And so if you think about people who are in the retail industry, people who are in the service industry, working in restaurants, if you're making minimum wage and you worked every single hour of the day, didn't take any time off, and you were making the minimum wage for the state of Michigan at $9.45 an hour, you would be in that 30% of AMI range of your income, which many people would think of as not workforce housing, but because our incomes are so high in our community, you can work full-time at minimum wage and still be in the very lowest income bracket. We call permanent supportive housing is housing usually for people who have had a history of homelessness, have a history of dual diagnosis, mental health issues, substance abuse, where they have on-site supportive services. Some housing is specifically for seniors. It may or may not be income specific. And then you have mixed income housing where you have a range of incomes in the same housing project. And market rate can be affordable or it cannot be affordable. It simply doesn't have any kind of income restrictions or rent or ownership restrictions on it. I'm not going to go into detail on this chart other than it's in your handout. If you're wondering what income levels are, the median income for Ann Arbor metropolitan statistical area, which includes Washtenaw County, is $92,900. That's what's circled in red. Everything else in this chart is a formula. In comparison, the state of Michigan, the median income is $67,300. We can come back later if you have questions. Everything in red there are all different kinds of programs that either provide a direct subsidy to housing to make it more affordable, or it's through some kind of zoning or planning process that makes it more affordable. And so we've included that by the income level that it is targeted to. How do you translate that into what your housing costs are? If you take 30% of each of those categories, this tells you by the number of people in your household what the maximum you should be spending on your housing costs would be. And just as an example, if you take a subsidized housing program and you looked at the state of Michigan, this is a chart showing what the rents would be set at various area median incomes. So for example, this is also a formula. A one bedroom is set at a household size of 1.5 people. however you want to define that. 2-bedroom is 3 people, and you can see that you may have a 2-bedroom at $1,046 or a 1-bedroom at $1,046, and depending on what your AMI is and what the bedroom size is, you can see what that maximum rent would be. And the thing you need to understand about programs that subsidize housing at a certain rent level, if your income exceeds that income it's targeted for, you cannot move in there. But unless you have a rent subsidy in addition to the rent cap, then you are going to pay the full amount of that rent no matter what your income is. So if you're somebody who's hovering around 30% of AMI and you move into a 1-bedroom that's the maximum is 60% AMI, you're going to pay $1,046 just like somebody who's making 60% AMI. You have to have an actual rent subsidy also attached to keep it at 30% of your income on your rent.
Jennifer, let me interrupt for
Go ahead.
just a moment, please.
Yes.
AMI, was that explained? Area median income?
Area median
That means half
income.
the people live below that, have an income below that, half the population has an income above that. So it's different than average.
Yes, and we're trying to cruise through these slides, but if you do want to stop and ask us a question, please do.
Just real
Okay.
quick, how many renters in the audience? Okay, nice. And homeowners? Other? Just kidding. Thank you, that just helps us know who we're talking to. Thank you.
All right, these are just some examples of income levels and where their AMI is for Ann Arbor, Washtenaw County. You can see at 80% AMI, there's even a lot of city jobs, including every ASME staff that works for the Housing Commission that falls within that 80% AMI range.
And federal programs for affordability go up to 80% AMI, so that's one of the reasons we talk about that. And then you saw in the earlier slide that some of our targets are more at 60 and 50% depending on the program at the city.
If you want to see how that translates into what our distribution is in our community, you may not be able to see the far left to the far right. It's basically under $10,000 is the far left, $200,000 plus is the far right. Ann Arbor is in red, the United States is in gray. And so you can see that there's a high disproportionate number of people on the very, very low income, under $10,000. Can anybody hazard a guess as to why that might be? Students, exactly. It doesn't mean that we have a preponderance of extremely low income households here. They are actually students. They self-identify as low income when they are asked by the Census Bureau how much income you have, because it is true. So even if your family is wealthy and they're helping pay for your apartment, you can still report that you make $3,000 a year, and that makes you extremely low income. How does that translate into our property values? And this is for Ann Arbor, not Washtenaw County. Again, comparing red is Ann Arbor, the United States is in gray. I have no idea what they're counting the far left as is under $10,000 unless it's personal property taxes. And the far right is $1 million, I think is the far right. So you can see we have a higher amount in the basically the $200,000 to $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 range of property values compared to the entire United States. And so how does that impact when you are trying to live here? As you know, when you are looking for a place to live, looking for a place to rent, your kids, people you know are trying to move here, it keeps putting pressure on the market. Housing is absolutely market driven. The more people who want to live here, the more people who want to rent here, it's going to drive up housing costs. And so if you don't have enough housing stock in your community, this is the natural curve of what it's going to look like. To take a look at how people are impacted by that, there's actually just over 26,000 people who live in Ann Arbor who work in Ann Arbor. There's just under 20,000 people who live in Ann Arbor who work outside of the Ann Arbor. And there's almost 90,000 people who do not live in Ann Arbor, but they work in Ann Arbor. So that's 90,000 people coming in Ann Arbor every work day, adding to the congestion, adding to the impact on our infrastructure, but who actually work here and aren't able to afford to live here.
following questions are open to all the panelists, but I'm directing them initially to Michael Apple, Teresa Gelati, and Jennifer Hall, because they're more focused on the low-income affordable housing. All right, so as Jennifer was explaining, this is a very expensive city. Rents for a single bed in the city are $800. Pretty much, it's hard to find a place for less than $800 a bed. It can be well over $100 a bed. We saw a chart that compares Ann Arbor with the nation in terms of housing, the value of properties. According to Zillow, the current median price for an Ann Arbor home is $377,200. That means half of all homes are more expensive than that. So in short, Ann Arbor is a very expensive place to live. All right, so the Ann Arbor Housing Commission has been providing subsidized low-income housing for over 50 years to residents who might otherwise not be able to afford housing in the city. Since 1992, Avalon, a nonprofit agency, has been providing housing and support services to homeless and other vulnerable populations in a very challenging housing market. These agencies and others provide numerous types of housing and support services in Ann Arbor, including public housing, which includes Miller Manor, Section 8 housing, senior housing, including Lurie Terrace, transitional housing, including Dawn Farm, nonprofit supported housing, including Avalon Housing. In addition, there are homeless shelters, including the Delanis Center. All right, so question A to any of the three panelists primarily. Is Ann Arbor able to meet the need for low-income housing in the city, and what are the chief obstacles?
No. It is not, and it hasn't been able to. The chief obstacles really are the competition in the marketplace for either land that is vacant or actually occupied apartment buildings, for example. The private sector is able to access capital quickly to be able to acquire properties, where those of us who work in the affordable housing arena actually have a very complicated, years-long process to acquire the capital to purchase any kind of property. And actually, I'm just going to go into that section and we'll come back to this one. So you may wonder, how exactly is housing developed to begin with? And I know Peter's going to go into this more detail, but I do want to mention that anybody who's developing housing, it's very high risk, it's site specific, it depends on what's going on in the marketplace, and so private developers are not going to be providing affordable housing in the marketplace if the numbers don't work. If the cost of acquiring property, the cost of doing the actual physical building or renovations is not covered by the rents you can charge, or if you're doing home ownership by the sales price, they are not going to be able to do it without some kind of subsidy. Subsidy can be land. So the city has public land that they own, the county has public land that they own, the university has public land that they own. So you can subsidize the cost of property. It can also be actual cash money that brings down the cost of acquiring the funds to do the development. And so that's why you do not see housing getting built that meets that moderate, low-income housing market, because it cannot be done without some kind of subsidy or some kind of zoning density. So we'll go into more details about that in a minute. So how the heck does it get built? You may be surprised that, in fact, HUD does not provide funding to build new housing. It provides very, very, very little money to do new kinds of affordable housing, including all the co-ops that were built in the 60s and 70s. They were built with various HUD subsidies. Those kinds of subsidies no longer exist. In fact, HUD's budget, as I show on here, was about $42 billion in 2018. The single biggest subsidy, or the single biggest impact to the federal budget that has to do with housing, is the mortgage interest and tax deduction that we all take on our taxes, all of us who own a home, take on our taxes. We still don't know what the impact of the new tax laws are going to be, but in 2017, the mortgage and interest deduction was $146 billion. compared to $42 billion for the entire HUD program. And so what ends up happening is that there's a new program called Low-Income Housing Tax Credits. I'm going to talk about it briefly because it's complicated, but it's actually an IRS program. It's not a HUD program. And basically what the government says, we're going to do private-public partnerships, and we will allow X amount of millions of dollars worth of tax credits to be available across the United States. Developers like Avalon and the Housing Commission, we apply to those tax credits. It's competitive. If we are awarded, we do not pay taxes. So it is not helpful to us. We have to sell them. And so if we get awarded $20 million in tax credits, we have to find an investor. It could be a bank, it could be a bunch of dentists, it could be a pension fund, and then they give us cash, and they get to write off that $20 million in taxes. It's no longer a tax they have to pay. That is the single biggest source of funding right now to develop any kind of new additional housing that has any kind of subsidy in it.
Do any of the other panelists want to help answer that question or have comments on it?
I mean, I think some of your other questions that I'm sure will come up go into the specifics of the Ann Arbor market, but that's the economics behind housing.
Right. What are the effects of zoning on affordable housing?
Well, I can speak in Avalon's experience in terms of acquiring and developing housing, which is it very much determines geographically where in the community we are able to find units that make sense for us, and where we're able to buy additional, where we are able to find land that allows us to build the kind of units that that we have. It's one of the reasons that if you look at a map, actually the 5th Ward has more affordable housing units than most other areas of the city. If you exclude the co-ops, that's even stronger. And that has to do with the zoning and what's zoned where. Other parts of the city are zoned overwhelmingly single family, or if they are multifamily, there are these larger plots of land that are suitable for 200 unit housing developments, which have not been the kind of affordable housing that the city has tended to prefer, which is smaller. And so as a result, when we've looked for anywhere from, I'll say 20 unit to 40 or 50 unit developments, which is kind of our sweet spot. We have some smaller, a couple bigger, but that we're limited by what's allowed by zoning and what exists.
And I was able to ask someone at the city of Ann Arbor to look this up for me recently. And the single-family zoning districts currently make up 38% of the existing zoning for the city of Ann Arbor. And I was like, okay, well, how does that compare to the public land? Because I always think of the university. And the public land, what's zoned public land is about 28%. That includes parks and university, et cetera, county buildings, things like that. So if you think about that, if we're taking out, 66% of the zoned land in Ann Arbor, that reduces the land area that would be available for development of affordable housing outside of it being single family. So it's important to think of it in context. And if I could just sort of put the two together, what Jennifer was saying about how the market operates and getting priced out of Ann Arbor and zoning, and you look at all the committed affordable units, these are those subsidized units that have rent and income restrictions, you'll see it weigh really heavily to the east side of the county. And that's because the market is a little bit more available there. It's a little bit cheaper to develop. And this is a history of it, right? So some of these units are very, very old. But more than almost 50% of all the committed affordable units are in the city of Ypsi and Ypsilanti Township. Of course, they don't make up half the population of the county. So we really have an imbalance. And when you start to look at where we have low-income populations and people of color, you see it also sort of being kind of creating a little bit more of concentration of poverty and some racial and economic segregation, which is a bigger, heavier concept, but a lot of these local actions lead to that on more of a regional scale. Oh, and here's the board map. Thanks, Michael. You led us right into that. So this is where we zoomed in. We did break it down by ward, and you can see it, the bigger circles, obviously more units and a larger development, but this is it across the different wards in Ann Arbor.
two big red dots are Lurie Terrace and what's the one out? That's Miller Manor. Right?
It might be Courthouse Square, not Lurie
Courthouse
Terrace,
Square.
actually.
Courthouse Square, I think.
Yeah.
I think Lurie Terrace is already taken out of here because they're technically out of their affordability period.
Got it.
All right. Anything to add on the impact of the University of Michigan on affordable
Yes,
housing?
I'd like to go into depth on that.
Go,
So the University of Michigan is by far the largest employer. So many of the folks who are coming into Ann Arbor that are commuting in are University of Michigan employees, whether it's at the medical center, health center, or at the university itself. It has a huge impact on our housing, not just the employers, but also particularly the students. Students have a really big impact. The trend in increasing of the student population has really been the largest proportion of increase in population in the city itself. And so when people see all the new downtown housing that's geared towards students, that is the marketplace reacting to the demand that is there by this large influx of students that appear on paper to be very low income, but are able to afford these very high prices based on their family's income. And that is definitely response, and I'll let Peter add to anything you'd like to add about the marketplace on that. The university does not and doesn't intend to provide 100% of student housing for all their students. In fact, they see it as a positive that the private sector is also providing student housing because they are also being taxed in the community. But there's such a big gap between the increase in students and the housing that's available and the amount of land that the university owns that is taken off the tax rolls, that is available for redevelopment, that it really has to be part of the discussion, and the solution is to have these conversations with the university. They're, for example, about to tear down their family housing that's been on North Campus for a very long time, which is great, fine, but please build back more, please build it back denser, add some mixed use, some more urbanized types of development, and not these very low density projects that they've been doing.
I'm just going to add to that real quickly is there's a gentleman named Ryan Tobias who works for a company called Triad Real Estate Partners. They're student housing developers. He puts out every year on his blog, their research report for the city of Ann Arbor and student housing. In 2017, they found that the occupancy was 99.39%, which was the highest they had ever seen in any college market. We had 1,250 beds come into the system in 2018. It's still an occupancy rate of 98%. It is a very high market. What he has described in the per bed rental market is that the big units, which are a lot of the things in the buildings downtown that we've seen over the last couple of years, those rents have gone up, 4 or 5% in similar buildings. But when you look at studio and one bedroom apartments, rents in existing buildings downtown have increased 12.5% and 11% for those unit types. We are not coming close to meeting student demand right now. If it is, the three most recent buildings came online at 99, 100, and 96% occupancy when they opened. That to me says, wow, we are not keeping up with the enrollment increases, and we continue to see record enrollments at the university. We have to start approaching this as a partnership, as Jen mentioned. This North Campus, the family housing area, is a huge chunk of land that has lots of potential to house students or workers. And these are discussions we've certainly had with the regents, and we haven't gotten anywhere with it. And I think until we have more productive conversations about their role in our housing market, we're going to struggle to keep up. We don't have any place else to go.
It's Fingerly in
Yes.
Fingerly, another property now taken off the tax rolls.
Partially.
Owned by,
Partially.
now owned by the University of Michigan, has lots of potential that could be built there. It is in the floodplain in parts of it, but they're gonna be building something there. Could there be some housing? That would be great.
Yeah, and just to go on to that, not just the students, you saw that commuter slide. You can see on this map, this is zip codes of all of the U of M employees, also the hospital. See how far they're traveling in. We know that the university sometimes has a hard time filling positions because they are dealing with people having to travel quite a distance on the, the kind of low and moderate income jobs that they have both at the university and the hospital. And so thinking about, you could do a housing product for students, you can also do it for faculty and staff. They are also in need of housing close to where they work. And since they are the biggest economic driver and the largest employer by far, it's another piece of the puzzle.
Does anyone have an idea of new housing that's geared towards students that's come online in the past few years? How much of that would you consider luxury housing? What are the average rent beds? Do we have any information on that? Bed rents, rather. Peter?
It's gone from $800 a bed to $1,500 a bed, particularly for the one bedrooms and the smaller units. I mean, parents are willing to pay anything to have their kids, particularly their daughters, walkable to campus, walkable to the classroom. And so the 6,000 students we've added in the last 10 years is not likely to abate. It's been about 2% per year. And those students are well funded. When you look at the percentage of their housing costs as a percentage of the total tuition and fees, particularly for an out-of-stater, to pay an extra $500 a month to the parents is very manageable, very preferable. In fact, the leases aren't signed by students anymore. The leases are signed by the parents. So this problem, as bad as it sounds, is only going to get worse for two reasons. Not only are the students growing, but the faculty and staff are growing, the number of students staying in town are growing, the number of retirees wanting to move back here. I had a conversation with Janice Swift the other day, said there was 500 parents driving in every day just to bring their kids to Ann Arbor Public Schools. You've got literally now hundreds, if not well over 1,000 students per year stay in Ann Arbor because the quality of life is so good, because the job opportunity is so good. So the crowding out that's going to occur on every bit of the housing inside the expressway ring is going to exacerbate significantly. So we're not getting ahead of the curve.
I would also say the new expensive housing is very attention grabbing. It's actually not the part of the student housing market that has been, I guess, most surprising in terms of, say, Avalon's attempts to find housing or understanding the demand, because new construction, in the absence of subsidy, will almost always be at the top of the market. It's the most expensive, has all the new amenities. What's been striking to me is with all of these units being added, that the old student housing between Packard and Hill in that area, the units get snapped up by the private market, the rents are not coming down, the occupancy remains high. And even though that's not attention grabbing, to me, that's what's telling us how tight this market is, and that you can add units and units and units, and the demand grows and grows and grows.
And we hear that repeated in Saline and Ypsilanti and Chelsea and Dexter, that those rents are going up. All the communities are, in the last 3, 4, 5 years, seeing sales prices and rental prices increase and people feeling the pressure and pushing out. The Ypsilanti area in particular, people are starting to actually get pushed out further east, out of Washtenaw. So it's definitely, I mean, it's very localized, but then also the entire area.
We're beginning to see what's happening in San Francisco on the West Coast. Great job generating companies, really intelligent people making grad degrees and making $50,000 to $150,000 a year are a curve like this. And Ann Arbor is so appealing from all the various accolades it gets. The university is not about to slow down on any one of their key areas. Their research budget, their faculty and staff, their grad students, certainly the undergrads that you would see most obviously with the new student high rises. So this problem is got to be looked at in totally new ways Because if you look at Boulder, you look at Berkeley, you look at San Francisco and California, and you look at New York, it is in dual security being sold for $2.35 billion. They've said, I've heard Doug Song say, the reason we were so successful is we were in Ann Arbor with this mindset of Midwestern hardworking people who were able to focus instead of thinking about the next job in another county. So that money trickling down into other startups in town is another way to look at the growing nature of the problem.
And I want to pull the conversation back to low-income housing for the next 15 or 20 minutes. And we're going to get more, we're going to continue with the workforce housing later on. Okay. Who in the audience is as a U of M student or staff?
Or retiree.
Or retiree? All right, so we got a handful here. All right. Okay. So, who are the populations that are served by the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, Avalon, and other providers of low-income subsidized housing? And what percentages of those populations come from Ann Arbor as opposed to coming from outside the city? You start.
Okay. We serve, even though we're the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, our primary subsidy is what people know of as Section 8 vouchers. Those are vouchers that you take to the private sector, and if they have rents that are within the range that HUD allows within our voucher, then you pay 30% of your income on rent, and then we pay the rest of the rent. Because of the cost of living in Ann Arbor, only about 1/3 of our voucher tenants actually are able to find a place to lease up in the city of Ann Arbor. The vast majority are Ypsi Township, Ypsi City area. Remember, we have a slide in here of our voucher usage. We have to serve, the maximum income is 50% of area median income, and 75% of our tenants have to be under 30% of area median income. But as we showed in the previous chart, that's a pretty high income threshold. Many, many people meet that income level. About a little less than half of our tenants have a disability. About 12 to 15% are seniors. But the vast majority are simply low-income residents. And how many are from Ann Arbor? I don't see it as any different than the rest of us. I was born in Seattle. I moved from Kalamazoo. I went to school at U of M. Now I live in Ann Arbor. Like, people move. People move who have housing. People move who don't have housing. Most people are in the county, come from the county, are priced out of Ann Arbor or from Ann Arbor.
So Avalon has over the years developed a very specific focus, what's called permanent supportive housing. So our tenants tend to be the lowest income. Well over half of our tenants have a disability. Most of our tenants have experienced homelessness at some point and in some way. And so our average income is just about $11,000. And this includes both single adults to families in 3-bedroom apartments. There's a range within that, but that's the average income, about $11,000. In terms of where folks come from, a couple of comments. One is something to remember. All of the subsidized housing we're talking about is driven overwhelmingly by federal subsidy, meaning that tax dollars that we're using to build the housing comes from people all over the country. So it's not appropriate for there to be residency requirements and priorities. I understand there's an interest in that question above and beyond, are we only taking care of our own, but implicit in the question is some priority which we really couldn't implement if we wanted to because of the nature of our subsidy. As Jennifer said, almost all of our tenants, I don't have a specific percentage, have lived somewhere in Washtenaw County, are part of this broad economic community. And what I would say in the bigger picture is, even if some number of people, for whatever reason, are ending up in units here who didn't come immediately from elsewhere in our community, what I feel very confident in saying is the dynamic of the private sector that we've talked about, of the market, is pushing out many more lower income households than the affordable housing stock could ever bring back in. So the net effect of all of this is still increased pressure on low income households.
And I just want to show a couple maps real quick that ties in both of these discussions, the university as well as low-income housing. So if you do a map based on poverty, this is how it looks. The darker areas are the highest concentration of poverty by census tract. I don't usually use that to determine who's really low income due to the student population. So if you compare that to looking at people who are on public assistance as a threshold on trying to determine where low income people live, you can see a very different map compared to one that you look at with poverty, with a much higher concentration on the eastern part of the county in the Ypsilanti area. The irony is HUD and other federal programs don't care if you're a student. If you're low income, that impacts the amount of money that comes to our community through different kinds of formula grants that are based on income. So we get more home dollars, or we get more block grant dollars. And what's another thing that's important is low income census tracts give you extra money for certain housing programs. And so a lot of these downtown census tracts in Ann Arbor make us eligible, if we were to do an affordable housing project downtown, for additional money because it's in a low-income census tract.
And that is partly skewed because of the
It's
student
100%
population.
skewed because of the student population, 100% skewed because of that.
Okay. All right, we're going to move into another, just for a few more minutes, into another set of questions, and this really gets into some touchy territory. So low-income housing is often met with NIMBYism, not in my backyard. And I want to bring up Water Hill again. It's a very rapidly gentrifying neighborhood in the city. Housing prices are going way up, and a lot of long-established residents who used to be able to afford to live there could not afford to live there today if they were trying to locate there. There's a lot of new, high-priced, high-density developments. But Water Hill and some of the neighborhoods bordering it, so roughly north of Huron Street by several blocks, maybe to Sunset, west of Main Street by several blocks, maybe to 7th, now has one of the highest concentrations of subsidized housing units, homeless shelters, supportive service units, and beds in Ann Arbor. Studies show that poverty is not correlated with negative neighborhood impacts, including crime, but high concentrations of poverty are. Some area residents complain that there is too much subsidized, very low income housing and supportive services in their backyard. And that this has led to increases in crime, police calls, and emergency medical calls, and has created an unfair burden on the neighborhood, while many other Ann Arbor neighborhoods have had far fewer or even no such units or services. Now, we did talk about the zoning a little bit, but we've got 38% to single family, 28% to public land, but that still leaves 66% of the city into multi-unit zoning. So, or commercial, or, okay, so we need to break that down further.
Industrial.
Okay. So the first question is, what are the strategies that Ann Arbor's public housing providers use for placement of affordable housing?
When you say public housing providers, you mean subsidized, or are you
Correct.
asking just Jennifer?
Subsidized.
Can I do a mini rant really quick?
Sure.
Sorry. I appreciate the concern about concentration of poverty, but I work for the county, so I have to kind of call out that while there's concentration in a little bit of a section of Ann Arbor, it is nothing compared to the city of Ypsilanti, where the vast majority, I believe it's 95% of all the subsidized housing in the city of Ypsilanti is south of Michigan Avenue, which is the predominantly African-American neighborhood that was segregated for many, many years. And so I just have to put that context in it. That is not to say that there isn't some pieces of that here, but if you look at it regionally and sort of the impact, again, of pushing people out where it does not compare to what's happening on the east side of the county. So I have to throw that out there. And we have some maps real quick about where we had, to your point, where population was in 1960, obviously there's a large history of racial segregation through redlining, through covenant deed restrictions. So this is where people could live. If they were African American in 1960, again, in that area that you were describing, Perrytown, Water Hill, and the south side of Ypsilanti, that neighborhood south of Michigan Avenue, where the vast majority of public housing is and subsidized housing, and then a section of Superior Township where folks that worked at the Willow Run plant that were African American were allowed to live. And so if you look at where that is now in the higher percentages of the African American population, you're seeing such a shift still to the east side, where we're still seeing now in 2019 racial and economic segregation. So I just have to wrap that around, because while we want to focus on the Fifth Ward, there is still this broader context, and I think it's still important to think about us as a region, because the housing market behaves as a region. So we got to think about it a little bit.
Chip, did you want to say something?
No, okay.
Oh, okay.
I can take a bit of a stab at it, but I'll start by prefacing it that since in the late 80s, 1980s, when I dropped out of grad school admitting that I was done, I've lived in 3 houses, all of them within a quarter mile of Mac's school. So the Water Hill neighborhood and the areas just to the, a little bit to the north, a little bit to the west are dear to my heart. So I guess I'll start out with an ironic question. That the same neighborhood that we talk about one moment as one of the most quickly gentrifying neighborhoods, most subject to the pressures of the market, we then at the same time bring it up in the context of an over-concentration of affordable housing.
Well, not just affordable housing, but very low income affordable housing, and
Yes.
much of it with supportive services.
Yeah, no, I understand. And it's true. I mean, I'm not, Avalon and the Housing Commission have a number of mid-sized to larger and a number of smaller projects in there. What I guess I'm pointing out is that we have that concentration, and whether you want to say despite it, or you want to say we'll take credit for it, the neighborhood is surging in value. It is a wonderful place to live, and it has these housing units in it. And I'm not dodging questions of that some of those projects at times have had a problem, and we've addressed it, that neighbors have called attention to something going on, and I believe we've addressed it. I think that's what Avalon tries to do. But I do think it's sort of unfair to both characterize a neighborhood as having an over-concentration of something that's identified as problematic when we're identifying that very same neighborhood as one of the most popular in the city.
I think it's something that we should celebrate. It's success when you can have the economic integration. I won't take up too much time, but while we're on the topic, just there are some people in the community who take offense to the word NIMBYism. So I would just like to put that out there to help advance the cause and the dialogue and the conversation, that we probably perhaps should at least know that, and maybe
They take offense to the term NIMBYism?
Yes.
And I'm not following what's the nature of the offense?
Because there's people who believe in development, but responsible development or organic development, that may be opposed to a certain project or two, and then they are labeled a NIMBY.
Oh.
And they just find it at times offensive.
Right.
So it's just, and we don't want to turn people off.
Could I just jump in, sorry, Ali, just real quick, on that specific question that was asked about the concentration of the low-income supportive services and, issues with the neighborhood. I feel a number of these calls over the last 3 years that I've been in office, and I think the most important thing is communication and open dialogue. So when I can call and talk to Jen and say, hey, I've had a constituent reach out to me, we have this concern, can we have a sit-down neighborhood meeting? I think it's that the neighborhood doesn't know who to talk to, doesn't feel comfortable about approaching the organization to say, hey, you know, we have a concern. You know, people are going through our garages, people are going through our cars at night if we don't lock the doors. I mean, these are legitimate concerns, but I think, you know, when the organization, the Housing Commission, particularly at Miller Manor, is given the opportunity to have an open dialogue with the neighborhood, say like, hey, yeah, we do have some problems, and we do, this is what we're trying to do to fix them, and call me when you have a problem.
And I can
You
attest
know?
to the fact, I own properties very close to Miller Manor, and I've called the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, and Jennifer has been extremely responsive. And I very much appreciate that, just to jump in there.
One of the things we've done is we manage and do maintenance for our properties, as does the Housing Commission. So we have a 24-hour number that our tenants would call. We give that number out to neighbors so that they have the same access. If they see a problem after hours, they can call us as well, and we make that available to them.
Okay, great, thank you. So just a little bit more on this subject. Are there plans to, future plans to place very low-income units, perhaps with supportive services, in other sections of the city that currently either have none or very few units?
I would love to put the type of housing we build and that Avalon provides in every part of the city. The barriers are still zoning, single family zoning. Like if you look at the second ward, it's almost, that is probably the highest amount of single family zoning as well as university owned property. There's very little affordable housing, designated affordable housing in those areas. Currently, the city council and the mayor have directed staff to look at city-owned property that's underutilized. Many of those properties are in the downtown. Whether or not it's in the fifth ward or not, it's a very shared area amongst all parts of the city, to see which ones make sense to have affordable housing, whether it's supportive housing, whether it's moderately priced, whether it's low income. So that will be coming back to city council and discussions in the community about that. There's some in the fourth ward, there's some in the third ward. I don't think there's any in the second ward, and I don't believe there's any in the first ward. Some of the ways to get more of a mixture of housing prices in all wards is really through the private sector, through zoning density, zoning bonuses to be able to increase the density of a site, to be able to provide lower cost housing on the same site as market rate housing. And I'm sure Peter will talk about that when he gets to his presentation, but that is absolutely something that can be done that isn't necessarily Avalon or the Housing Commission, but it's the private sector providing housing as well.
And very specifically, Avalon has 50 units in our pipeline that we hope to complete on Platte Road as part of a larger development, but we'll be doing 50 supportive housing units there. It's not coincidental that that's land that the county owned and controlled and made available for low-income housing, and I think you're gonna, as we move this forward more and more, you'll hear about publicly owned land being an incredible resource for doing, for siting housing that's affordable.
And to Ali's point, I always thought that we should have a Not in My Backyard campaign where we pick a site everywhere in every neighborhood, and you have to pay us. If you don't want us to build there, and then we're gonna use your money, and we're gonna build somewhere else, yes, we embrace what you want.
Arbor Hills, for instance? Yeah, okay. All right, any other comments on this section from the panel? All right, we're gonna take a 10-minute break.
Folks, I'm a developer. Boo. That I teach development. I have for almost 40 years. I've been a developer in Ann Arbor for about 50. As you walk North Main and try to get onto the Arbor Dam, you cross the parking lot to walk over the tracks, you're walking right through the properties I bought 20 years ago. I look at the role of a developer as implement the community plan. And Ann Arbor, understanding the community plan is a challenge. I've been thinking about, I got a 5-year renewal of my teaching contract 2 years ago, and the top of the list of issues to solve as far as Ann Arbor were these issues of affordability, gentrification, and it became clear to me that you needed to couple it with 2 other very important agenda items. I've always found it easier to think big. So I coupled it together with sustainability and climate action and transportation. And if you address one of those, you address the others. If you exacerbate the problem of 1 or 2, it makes a problem for all 3 of them. I have 150 really, really bright kids a year, and I've learned, it's been an incredible experience of lifelong learning. I grew up as a Democrat. My dad was the head of the ACLU. My mother was the president of League of Women Voters. Come from a little blue-collar town. So I get how important this affordability issue is. And I see it getting significantly worse unless we can find a way to get out in front of it and solve it to scale. And to scale, to me, is 500 to 1,000 units a year. So I understand a developer, and every one of those development projects on Southview, all those student-driven high-rises, they made $15 to $20 million per building for those developers. And they're typically out of town. And they typically finish them and sell them. And most of them are U of M grads. Only 2, the Zaragon, are owned by local people. They built them and they kept them. But he's from Chicago, another U of M grad. So how do we solve these 3 problems? And last summer, I took my best students and hired them for the summer to address those 3 issues. And then we applied it, so flip now to the Y, we applied it on the YMCA, no, flip to the other, We applied it to the former YMCA. And we really worked hard on it for 2 semesters. And it's good to see that now becoming an RFP. And so that is the parking lot owned by the city, the libraries across the street, the William Street parking deck is the big building in the lower left. So how do we solve all 3 of these issues? And it's not a 5th Ward problem. It's an entire city. In fact, it's the entire county. And the way we did it here was flip to the next slide. This is a student rendering you did in 10 hours. This is a high-density solution. And Ann Arbor hates high density. But it's one of the ways to address the affordability, sustainability, and the transit issues. You gotta have density. You gotta have it downtown. You gotta have it next to the transit center. You gotta have it lots of ways, multimodal, to get people out of their car. People who work in the area should be able to live in the area. Not commute, not 80,000 cars a day coming in from out of town for U of M. I love the point U of M is clearly part of the problem. And the fact that they just agreed to cooperate with the city on building a road and pop for $1 million was a step in the right direction. So what's the solution? The solution is we take every publicly owned parking lot, starting with those downtown, starting with the Y. Think about the Klein's lot. Think about the parking lots at 4th and Catherine, up against Braun Court, right next to Carytown. Think about the parking lot in front of Community High, owned by the schools. Think of the parking lot in front and to the left of Huron High School. Think of the parking lot in front of Pioneer and Skyline. Think of the parking lots of the universities downtown. So every publicly owned parking deck needs to be in play, needs to be rezoned PUD, which is a very negotiable, arbitrary zoning category where there's lots of stakeholders all having an input as to what is it. You bury all the current parking below grade. You pay for it. If it's in the DDA, you pay for it with the DDA. And that's good for their agenda. You don't necessarily match the parking that's there because we're trying to wean people of their cars. So any parking that's put underground is built to have an alternative use someday. Someday it's a storage facility. Someday it stores water from the site. I don't know. But you don't build it strictly for parking. And you build only the fewest number of spaces that are absolutely essential. And you link it with all kinds of pedal power, walking power, the tree line trail expanded all the way around downtown. And the first floor is excite the sidewalk retail. In the Wise case, it's a great place to put a downtown grocery store, a Plum or a small Kroger, but it's a large format 20,000 square foot grocery store. It's a perfect place for it, particularly for the grab and go. You get your meal and jump on the bus. So we came up with this idea. This is 25 stories. Chris looked at this several months ago and said, it's too tall. Well, yes, but you have to look at the trade-offs. It could be 15 stories. The zoning allows 180 feet. That's a big debate. Sure, we don't like height, but we also don't like gentrification, negative impact, and we don't like loss of affordable housing, and we don't like having everybody get in the car and drive alone. Okay, so there's a lot of debate. And then we're going to put above it, every one of these lots is going to be at least 20% affordable, at 30 to 60% AMI. I can't, whether we go lower than 30% AMI is a public policy debate. Whether we go more than 20% affordable is a debate. And these lots are never sold. Every one of these publicly owned parking lots, whether it's owned by the city, the public schools, the county, or the university, are held in perpetuity for the benefit of Ann Arbor as part of the trust fund, and 15% of the earnings of the building goes to the landowner as a land lease, 99-year land lease. So they're never sold. They can always finance them, they can sell them, they can mortgage them, but they're kept in the public domain. So you have the market rate housing subsidizing the affordable housing in the building. So these work privately without the low-income housing tax credits. They work without HUD support, and the land lease is an extra kicker to the public owner to spend that for vouchers, to allow people to go live anywhere in the county, to put more low-income housing in the actual building, to do it in the neighborhoods, to help whatever the low-income housing trust fund in Ann Arbor sees as appropriate. So publicly owned land, long-term land lease, 80-20, 20% affordable, 80% market rate on publicly owned land, and it has to be done by all 5 property owners that own public land. The city, the county, the university, the public schools, and the AETA. The AETA owns 25% of the site because of the air rights over the Blake Transit Center. So that's included here, all right? So that's basically what I think is a way to scale up and begin to deliver both market rate and affordable. If we don't have the market rate housing as well, we're going to continue to make the problem worse because there's going to be a crowding out of the affordable people and the market rate people pushing out the affordable because we're constrained. The transit is a big issue. The tree line trail is a great idea. It is going to happen sooner or later, but to me it's 2.5 miles to go from Elko Pond, right there are my properties, which is nice, but all the way down to the Michigan Stadium isn't good enough. It's got to go down here and down Stadium, all the way to Washtenaw, all the way to Huron Parkway, all the way north of Huron Parkway to Plymouth Road, and back down Plymouth Road to the river. So I think I've used up my time. All right. So I've got copies here to pass out if anybody wants to look at this stuff. And if you give me your email afterwards, I'll send you an electronic copy, okay?
All right. Thank you very much. Ann Arbor's been on a mission of growth for several years, a policy that has been highly controversial. One of the chief rationales for this direction has been to increase the city's tax base. And while economic development is generally positive, growth has implications for the housing market. New economic development has brought an influx of higher income residents to the city, and much of the new housing supply has been built for that market. This has raised the cost of the overall housing market and driven some current residents out. So the first question is, and I think I'm probably going to direct these mostly to our council members and Peter, if you want to join in, and anyone else, but what are the long-term consequences of Ann Arbor's economic development strategy on its housing market? And I want to add something parenthetical there too. We did talk about the effect of the university and decreasing student body on housing, but I want to focus more on economic development that has drawn a lot of high-tech industry, for example, to this town, and those are very high-paying jobs. So a much higher income average than what was here a few years ago. So what are the long-term consequences of Ann Arbor's economic development strategy on its housing market?
Well, I can take a stab at this. It seems like it's a broad question. Well, it's had some positive impacts. Obviously, we had an additional $600,000 come into the general fund this year from the property tax revenue from the new development. But it does also pose a challenge. I mean, it has a lot of unintended consequences. But we have an aging infrastructure. We need to look at, and it's stressing the infrastructure out, whether it's the roads or things in the ground. And then also, when we add, units for retirees and other folks who are not punching a time clock per se, we're also adding needs for services for those residents. And so when we add, that type of housing, we're not adding, times two the housing for supportive services and goods that those residents may require. So that is an issue that happens, and it puts a squeeze on the workforce housing staff. And so that's something that come up a long time ago. I haven't discussed it, but that is something that we also face. I can go in more, but I want to leave time for questions and my colleague to respond as well.
So, I think I'd push back, Steve, a little bit. We haven't grown that much. We've added 7,000 people in the last 18 and a half years. It's not very many people. We, as a community, made a decision not to grow outward in the 1980s. I can't tell you why that decision was made, why we decided we weren't going to annex anybody else, but when you make that decision and you have an engine like the University of Michigan and the hospital, you are saying we have to figure out how to do this all within our borders and working with our neighbors. And when you look at the very, very modest number of housing units that have been added here, in the last 20 years, from 2000 to 2018, we added 5,000 total new multifamily units. That might seem a lot, but it's way short of what Peter was talking about 500 a year. And why is it important to look at this unit type? I think it's important because we're not growing outward. The issues that we have is we're not letting more people live here. But our economy, particularly the university, I wouldn't necessarily say it's the tech industry or what's happening downtown, but it's the university that's driving most of this. We have 90,000 people that drive to work here every day. The number one complaint that I hear when I talk to people is traffic. If we're not going to create housing here, that traffic's going to continue to get worse. And we have no way to build more roads. We don't have space, and we shouldn't be making it easier to drive alone. And part of the reason I've pulled some of these statistics together is when you look at Ann Arbor and our surrounding communities, Pittsfield, Scioto, Ypsi City, Ypsi Township, and Dexter, the communities that have the highest number of people percentage of people that commute to work via walking and biking is in Ann Arbor, where we still have half of our people that work here drive alone. And so when you look at the three-legged stool that Peter was talking about, the sustainability and the affordability and the quality of life, if we don't treat these as interrelated things, they all break. And I feel like we're at a breaking point with traffic right now. I feel like we're at a beyond the breaking point of affordability right now. And that, drives at the soul of who we are, because ultimately, some hedge fund grad from Ross School of Business is going to be able to come in and buy a house in Water Hill no matter what. And somebody that's lived there forever is going to say, it's hard for me to live here. The taxes are high. I have to work, 60 hours a week at my job. It's easier to sell and go someplace else. And, with that dynamic, there's not an easy fix. If this were an easy thing, we would have solved this years ago.
The idea of putting a huge parking deck and housing at each of the expressway entrances in Ann Arbor, and then they all shuttle to their jobs and their respective key places at U and downtown and the hospital and North Campus and so on, I think is feasible. But we have to have the shuttle service that can really get them quickly from just outside the expressway ring and every one of the key arteries to the jobs.
And, this requires us to make fundamental changes to the way that we have thought about how we get around, how we live, where we work, what choices we make. And that is challenging. That's a hard thing to overcome, 75 years of auto dependence. And we're struggling with that. And when you go and you knock doors and you talk to people the way that I have, people very much care about all of these things. But then I often hear, well, I want to be able to drive across town at 5 o'clock in 10 minutes like I used to be able to.
Park outside the store.
Well, it doesn't work anymore in the environment that we've created because we don't have enough people living here. We don't have the services within neighborhoods that historically would have been in a neighborhood. We have concentrated areas of shopping, of retail, of services. To be able to add that density, and density is important. It doesn't always necessarily mean height, but that density allows for more neighborhood commercial, which allows for more entrepreneurism. It allows for more community feel. When you talk to people in neighborhoods, they say, I just want a corner store. I just want a little bodega. I want a downtown grocery store. And it's really hard to talk to somebody to say, you know what, nobody's going to do it because there are not enough rooftops here. And there has to be a density to support that because at the end of the day, those people need to make money too. And so we've got these issues that we struggle with in the community about where can we add density, where are people comfortable with it, where are they not comfortable with it. And a lot of this, goes back to, hey, this is a single family zone neighborhood, you can only have a single family house. I think and I hope we're moving to a situation in this city where instead of saying, well, it has to be one family in this house, that we start to identify what the form of a particular neighborhood is. And then say, I don't care if there are 4 families in there or 1. It doesn't matter, as long as the building fits in with the rest
What
of
if you
it.
take those parking lots of the junior highs and the grade schools and do the same small version of this idea of a little bit of neighborhood retail and some housing on top that people can move to from their house because they want to age in place?
Okay, so there's a whole list of questions on this that we're not going to get to, but based on the conversation that's ensued, I want to boil it down into 2 additional questions. One is, and Peter, you can probably answer this better than anyone, can developers get a return on investment on workforce housing, and I don't know exactly how that's defined, in the city of Ann Arbor?
If you leave it to the private sector, it won't get done. They're just too easy to make too much money building private sector housing. So it's got to be a zoning change. It's got to be mandated that it's 20% affordable, 80% market, or something close to that. And you got to make that part of the entitlement zoning process, and then they'll do it. And you might give it a density bonus, as we've done in the past for various public policy arguments. But if you leave it to the private sector, it ain't going to happen.
Can you demand of the private sector without them suing the city that
If it's a
100%
master plan,
of the units?
This
be-
RFP that the city has got out right now, there's one for the Y, there's another one to begin the master plan, neighborhoods and key corridors. You can pick it up into that agenda.
Okay, great.
So that legislation is beginning to come together.
We can't currently require through all neighborhoods that 20% of like a subdivision is affordable, but we could do different density bonuses. So you could say, downtown, we already have it built in, the HB2 zoning, so if you do a certain threshold, and you do affordable, you can get a higher height or FAR. You could also think about your single-family neighborhoods and say, if you do a handful of duplexes or triplexes, then we could require some other, so a density bonus.
Okay, and so that,
Yeah. Sorry.
no, that's,
Yeah.
just a couple more minutes. We're gonna,
I think I'm trying to clarify what you said and reconcile it with what Peter said, because I believe Peter's plan, you'll notice he's focusing on publicly owned land. It's the public ownership of the land that eliminates the concern about restricting rents from private owners. They don't have to respond to the RFP, they don't have to build on that plot of land. In Michigan, I don't know the details, it's either incredibly difficult or currently illegal for the city to very broadly on privately owned land create zoning regulations that limit rents.
okay. And then in terms of density, in downtown, we're getting these we've got a lot of very high buildings, which 10-story plus. There's been a certain amount of pushback on that. But we have a lot of areas of the city which are zoned single-family housing, some on very large lots. Are there policy tools, are there political solutions to increasing densities in these single-family neighborhoods, say even allowing granny flats, for instance, which could...
That's your best answer, is to allow the granny flat idea to grow and to loosen up the current regulations so that you can take a garage, you convert it, you can take something, put it in the excess land. But it's a rezoning of a single-family neighborhood, and it's not going to be easy. An easier way to get to scale is to use these publicly owned parking decks or parking lots in those neighborhoods to do something appropriate density on those.
And the obstacle to rezoning the single-family land is, the obstacles are?
The neighborhood. I mean, Peter's saying this as a developer. I don't think Ali or I would be necessarily championing turning the old west side into, 5-story by right zoning. We talk to people, there is the reality of getting elected. I think when Peter says rezoning a single-family neighborhood is hard, I would venture a guess that it's the hardest thing to do in the city of Ann Arbor.
I would attempt it.
All right, we've run out of time for this segment of it. We're going to turn it over to your questions. Thank you very much to the panelists for answering our questions and helping us out here tonight. And I'm going to turn it over to Loretta, who's going to help field the questions from the audience.
So yeah, there's questions that we have. Some of the other precinct delegates have questions from people who left that they want to pose to you guys. So Lisa has some questions, and I think she's going to share them with Kristen and Sarah. Did you have a question?
This is someone that.
Oh, somebody had a question. Okay, all right. Sure. Okay, so you guys have, okay, I'll start with this question. Is that okay? All right, so what happens when you run out of the finite, limited amount of public land we have? I'm not sure who that should go to.
I'm gonna try it, because I think Peter mentioned it, so, public land is the easiest maybe to deal with, but some of these tools that are talking about policy changes and rezoning, we kind of need to do both, right? There is a finite amount of public land, there will be some challenges with that, so we need to, as the city starts up its master planning process, they just went through an RFP and starts to think about it, I think there's gonna be some really great conversations we can have about the characters of the neighborhood, about some small incremental zoning changes. Chip mentioned, can you have a form of a building that could handle 1 family, 4 families, but it fits in the neighborhood, right? Can you do accessory dwelling units that fit in and they don't look any different? You can't tell. It fits perfectly in the neighborhood. Can you look at corridor zoning, which all of our corridors, if you think about Stadium, Plymouth has a little bit of density, Washtenaw, single story, because Ann Arbor is considered to be sort of more suburban, not urban, by a national developer. But if you go up 2 stories or 3 stories and you have residential above, that's some ways that we can add more housing in and potentially affordable housing. So we have to start thinking about those changes along with public land, because not just one thing is going to start it. I think public land's the kind of a quicker way that we can make some progress in the short term and then start having these long-term conversations along the way.
But to be realistic, there is more underutilized public land than private land.
Yeah. With the university and
The schools, the university,
Yes.
if you look at all the public entities, that is a very significant amount of opportunity.
Okay, so if there's questions from the audience, these questions that we have here are for people who are either here and just want to write them down or are not going to be here. But if you guys have questions too, then let us know and you can definitely pose them to our panelists. You have a question or did you want to?
If you'd like to.
Yeah, you can ask a question. That's fine.
Does the city have any effective leverage in negotiating with the University of Michigan on issues that we've been talking about today, or is it just David and Goliath and we're just under their thumb?
That's a good question.
I mean, I would defer a little bit to the mayor on this question. But I do think that our relationship has to be symbiotic. If they're going to attract the best research talent and the best faculty and the best students, this has to remain an awesome place to live. And so there has to be a partnership. Have I been frustrated at the resistance to looking at some of the models that I see in other urban university places, where places like the University of Pennsylvania heavily subsidizes workforce housing around its medical campus? These are all possibilities, and I feel like the relationship between the university and the city has changed very dramatically just in the last 5 or 6 years. I think it is very important to continue to collaborate. I think I'm always going to be frustrated at how slowly they move on these things, and that they don't always treat us as an equal partner. I'm not sure how we can change that dynamic.
Like my colleague said, it has to be a symbiotic relationship, and I think university, it is an institution of education, but it also is the largest employer. And myself being a downtown employer, I understand that we're at a moment of crisis right now in finding employees. So I think that is eventually going to hit home for the University of Michigan as well, where they're going to find it extremely challenging to find employees at a certain point if things continue on the trajectory that they're at. So I think it might affect them when it comes as an employer. Maybe not for their student body that comes from out of country that can pay the extra $1,000 a month for 4 years, where it doesn't mean that much of a difference. But I think as an employer, it's going to affect them at some point.
Question from Lisa.
To piggyback on Frank Wilhelm's question, I had the same question, and I asked our now Senator Jeff Irwin about this problem. And he said that in the state constitution or the legislative body of laws, there's a provision where the universities, public land grant universities, are supposed to be resource or revenue sharing with their host cities. So I'm curious whether that's happening, what we know about it in city council, has that been explored?
Sounds like we should get an answer from our mayor.
Where's Howard at?
I'm unfamiliar with that, and I've never heard anybody make reference to that before, so I don't think that, I think that, well, I've never heard about that before, and I suspect that that's something that.
I would love to follow up, and then when I find out, I will relay to my board representatives.
Fair enough.
Okay.
It's often fire services for sure, at the very least, because the city's fire department covers the fires. The fire services, I don't know, I'm so fine. Fire services are one way that there's shared cost revenue, but it only goes to the fire department for those shared ones. It used to be more, but I know for sure that that piece is covered. It's just a question, it's been reduced over time.
Chris, can I ask you a question? The president's solicitor creating this net neutrality, this sustainability agenda and this new commission, including some city employees, is that a way to get us to work together?
On housing issues, I mean, it's certainly a point of entry. Broadly, when we've raised issues with respect to housing at the university, what they tend to say is this: I think as Councilmember Amlalo was indicating, they are, and Councilmember Smith as well, they are interested in the city being successful because the city's success is a necessary condition for the university's success. That said, that's only really a threshold question, right? Like, we could be unhappy to a point, we just can't get to that point. When we talk to the university about why don't you all build more housing, they're like, here's why. Housing is super expensive and capital intensive. And sure, we could borrow it. Sure, we could spend it out of our endowment. We're not going to do that. Sure, we could borrow it, but if we borrow it, then that's going to increase our debt load, and that's going to put, frankly, our AAA bond rating at risk. And the AAA bond rating is sort of a mark of quality for them, and that's something that they focus on. Is that,
That's baloney.
I'm just telling you what they say.
They partner with the private sector.
Public-private partnership,
And they put
that's
down the
exactly
private
right.
tax rules, which is important, and they just take a land lease, it's very passive, and they have no risk.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Any
we
more
got more
questions?
questions, we got more questions, yes.
Michigan State is the only land grant university in the state.
I'm sorry, what?
Michigan State University is the only land grant university in this state.
Is that a question or?
It was in response
Oh, it's
to,
a response.
so
Okay.
University of Michigan is not considered a land grant.
I can't say that all the time.
I'm pretty sure they don't share any money
So
with
we-
these lands.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I'm a Ward 5 resident, and first of all, huge shout out to Loretta and everybody for pulling this together. Amazing panel, amazing turnout. I mean, who likes talking about housing on a Tuesday? Cool people, I would argue, but just a huge kudos. So to whoever wants to take this on, I don't know who this is a question for, but Ann Arbor, we clearly have housing issues. Do we have a housing crisis? And if we don't, like, how do we know when we're there?
I would go as far as calling it a crisis, and I appreciate what you said, Jessica. Thanks for putting this together, and sorry I didn't say that earlier. But I think we are at a crisis. I think as employers, we can't have a sustainable community, when you can't live where you work, even for teachers and nurses and firefighters and police officers. Those used to be jobs that offered you an ability to have a second home, as a kid growing up, and now they can't have a first home. So I don't think it's alarmist to call it crisis.
And I think I would agree, and I think the good thing about being in a crisis is it often spurs action, and there seems to be a lot more awareness and support for taking action, not just locally, but at the federal level that we haven't seen. I never used to get invited. I've been doing this for 30 years. I didn't get invited to community meetings to talk about affordable housing. Like, people are very concerned, so hopefully that means we'll take some action.
I also think to use that question to make the conversation a little more subtle but also honest is it's who's having a crisis in our community.
Yes.
And so for low-income persons, this crisis is evident in the demographics for decades. For communities of color, especially the African-American community, if you look at census tracts that are above 20 or 30% African-American, that used to be in the city of Ann Arbor and no longer are, that's a crisis because it physically moves a community somewhere, not of its own choice. And now what we're hearing is for businesses and for the core economy, it's becoming a crisis too. So to me, it's, let's always figure out who are we asking about.
I mean, the other group that we haven't addressed very specifically in this discussion is seniors. And as I look around the room, I see some silver hair out there. I am much closer to that designation than I'd like to admit. But, as we see the aging of the community, there is going to be a lack of the type of housing that we need here. And because of Prop A at the state level, there are a lot of people that are essentially trapped in a house that's not right for them as they age. And I think there's a little bit of as somebody said today, a shell game at the state level with how we do that funding. But ultimately, we as a community, I believe, have a strong core value of wanting people to be able to age in place in our community and stay a part of Ann Arbor. We're not set up for that. And we're going to see, not just in the low-income population, not just in the African-American community, but in all of our seniors, lots of people won't be able to live here because we don't have the housing for them anymore. And that, to me, is a crisis.
Thank you. Go ahead. Did you have a question?
Well, I was just gonna say that I am observing like all kinds of the assisted living facilities popping up everywhere. I will just like not go into one of those kinds of places, but they know that that is the next, and we've got the evidence from all our homeless research, the pit count and all that, that is the next biggest concern is the seniors are being chased out of their homes.
What was your question? Was it a question or a comment?
So I was just commenting that it is serious. I mean, if you are doing research on homelessness and stuff, that they have the evidence that the seniors are losing their homes. And the seniors are, and these developers, like I said, they know if those assisted living places all over, because they know that that's the market.
Thank you.
Yeah, on the eve of the budget for the city, I see that there is some money now allocated for affordable housing, just shy of about 900,000. And there was a possibility of that being kind of earmarked for 8 years, which would be then you could bond for it and actually create a larger project and leverage the funding and all that. But now you've got a little bit of money coming in for 1 year. Not to say that's not awesome and it's better than zero. But what do you do with 880,000 for 1 year, and what could it have been?
Well, I think you can still do a lot.
I was gonna say she can spend that.
There's a lot you can do because
Very talented.
the cash, so to speak, that comes from local tax dollars can leverage other funding sources like local housing tax credits. We have to pull together. We did a study retroactively of what local general funds have been spent on and how much it's leveraged, and it's on average $25 for every dollar of local funds. And so if you multiply that 880 times 25, and even if it's for 2 years or 3 years, it can add up to a lot. But I do think we need to have discussions on a policy level internally at the city and the county about bond financing for affordable housing, because at the state level, it says that the city cannot lend its credit to a private entity, which would be Avalon, it would be Peter, but it wouldn't be the Housing Commission because we're a public entity. So like we're having those discussions about can we leverage the bond financing as well.
And to amplify what Jennifer said, at least in the current model of doing housing that's affordable, sort of as we defined it here, the 60% or below, outside of incredibly wealthy, larger metropolitan areas like maybe a San Francisco, the notion of locally funded affordable housing, frankly, doesn't make a lot of sense. I don't know of any place that's doing it in any serious way, which is my way of saying, yes, the longer the commitment, the more the money, the more creative we can be in terms of leveraging it. But 800,000 of local funds goes a long way in terms of us taking a project to the state to get tax credits, to get subsidy here, to HUD in various places. So I don't think it's probably a smart measure to look at the total cost of a housing development and try to put that into a local funding pot.
I agree. Locally, we should not pay 100% of a subsidy of a housing project. You can leverage private funds, you can leverage public funds, you can leverage foundations, You can borrow money from a bank, you have rent coming in from whoever is living there, and so there's lots of ways to finance it.
And I've heard from these two that that's the most flexible funding, so it's super important with that whole package, because it doesn't have all those requirements that federal funding has, so it's really important to have something that can be more flexible.
You don't have any other questions? We have a question here.
I have a question about, I often hear, I'm not sure I feel this way, but taxes creating an affordability issue. So my question is concerning development and upzoning single-family housing areas. Would the impact of that potentially a broader tax base reduce the taxes that are creating an issue a lot of the long-term residents might be having an issue with? I feel like the effects of that might, with the water infrastructure especially, and things, if you're spreading it out over a large group of people. I just want to know the validity in that to do with the tax increases.
Did you guys hear that question?
Yeah.
Okay. You got an answer?
If I understood, the new tax money that comes into the city lowers the taxes that the rest of the community pays. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm asking if that would potentially slow the rate of increase of taxes if you're spreading it out over a broader, a larger population, more dense population.
I don't think it's going to have a measurable impact.
Prop A goes a long way towards keeping your taxes.
Yeah, I mean, Prop A
And to be clear,
caps your.
statewide Prop A.
Yeah, statewide Prop A is, something that was 1994 that caps the rate at which your property tax can increase. What is it?
5%.
5% inflation, whichever's lower.
Right, and so the recession knocked everybody's housing value down. We in Michigan, I think the last thing I saw, we're not going to be able to be back where we were until 2030 if the economy keeps going well, to where we were at the beginning of the recession, just in what we generate statewide in property tax. So, a lot of, when I say that people get trapped in their houses with Prop A, so if I'm a senior and I own my house and I've lived there for 40 years, my taxes aren't very high. My assessment is probably very low. But as soon as I do a major improvement or I sell it, those go up to current value. And then to replace that, I have to buy into that marketplace, and I cannot get that value. So when I knock doors, you talk to a lot of people who say, I can't do stairs anymore. I live on my first floor, essentially, and I don't have the money to keep up my garage, which is falling down. But I can't afford to live anyplace else. And that, to me, is indicative of a big crisis that is going to hit us much, much harder than we are anticipating.
And a really robust ADU, accessory dwelling unit, you can take that extra land, that big lot, or just the garage and convert it to another housing unit, where somebody can also help you out to age in place even better.
But again, with Prop A, we didn't get the money from the state that we were promised either. So there's like a $50 million shortfall between what we were supposed to get and what we have gotten. So.
Okay, Lisa?
To also, to relate to your question, when Ali and Chip and the gentleman from Avon Housing, and I'm sorry I don't remember everybody's names, when you were talking about housing our teachers, housing our policemen, housing our firefighters, they want to live like I've been fortunate to buy into. It was a 1,300 square foot house in a nice west side neighborhood with a yard, and I have, half of a garage, and I have great neighbors, and I can get to downtown by foot, by bike, and when I need to, buy groceries, because there's nothing downtown outside of Argus. Thankfully for Argus, I have to drive. So that's the model when we're talking about building density, the ADUs, and kind of infitting more housing into our current neighborhoods. That's kind of what we need. But I've been here for many, many years. I pay as much money in property tax that my sister does just outside of Chicago. and I've been heavily amended in. People who move in, these new teachers, these new firefighters, they want to buy here, they're buying in their property. Even if they could afford the house, their annual property taxes are scary. So I do think property taxes are an issue in affordability as well. And so we're talking about affordability. I play a little violin for the university. It's so little. I'm more concerned about the other people, not the two hands that are here because they're staff or students, but for everybody else who is here in Ann Arbor doing other non-university jobs. Those are the people we need to be concerned with. And the high rises, if we wouldn't live in them, you know, when we're building a plan about where we're gonna put people, we have to think, would we or our neighbors live in that too? I don't think high rises work in a town like Ann Arbor because we're an island in southeastern Michigan. We have no transit system to take us to Detroit, to take us to other parts. Yeah. The question was, why are we so focused on the university for all those reasons when we really need to be taking care of people who are our young professionals moving in, or elderly people who can't afford property taxes?
I'll simply answer this question. There's not a single firefighter that works for the city of Ann Arbor that lives within the city limits. I do not believe there's a single police officer that works for the city of Ann Arbor that lives within the city limits. We have only grown 6,000 people in 20 years. We are not building housing. We don't have enough housing for people to live here. We don't even have enough housing to house the students that are coming.
I don't care about
You know, it is, it impacts everybody. You can't stick your head in the sand about it. You know, I think you can say, this isn't where I would live. I mean, there are lots of places I wouldn't choose to live, but lots of people choose to live there. You know, it is a matter of trying to create more housing here. And this is not, you know, I get a little bit tired of the trickle-down housing debate. We have built in 20 years 5,200 units of multifamily housing. That's it. That's nothing.
That's nothing.
I mean, we have 90,000 people that commute in here every day. You know who wins in that equation? The 1%. And when we talk about the diversity of this community, and we talk about the soul of this community, there isn't any when you don't build housing.
Okay, so we've, this is a question from an audience member. We've discussed accessory dwelling units a bit already, but the question is, what is the status of the suggested changes to the ordinance, and how likely are those changes to be approved soon?
I think it's in the council, right?
It's in planning, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm a rookie still when it comes to certain things, but reducing the requirements of being 5,000 square feet as the lot size, I think is one of the requirements in place now. The lot size needs to be 5,000 square feet, but we also have recently, you know, made it less restrictive for the utility hookups and more affordable. The problem with ADUs is that banks don't lend for those. I mean, it's a matter of economics. It's unless you're well-to-do and you really want, you know, your family to be living in your backyard or next to you, it doesn't make economic sense as for someone to build it as a way for their retirement plan. It's a money pit. You cannot make it succeed financially on top of the regulations that are in place to protect these single-family home areas.
Parking a tiny home in the backyard.
But just, you know, the economics of it, it's $150,000 to build something. And it's just, frankly, people, that is, for me, I think is the number one, you know, thing that keeps them from being built.
We can't do anything to make it less effective than it is now. We haven't approved a single one, you know, so like it clearly doesn't work. And if you look around the country at the places that have done these things, you know, Portland also started very slowly in this, and they found out, hey, we're charging people way too much to hook up the water system to do this. And as soon as that fee dropped from $40,000 to $10,000, they saw a flurry of activity. You know, having been a part of that discussion politically during one of my campaigns and then on council, like, that was an incredibly heavy lift to get this ordinance passed that hasn't done anything. You know, there is considerable opposition to the changes that have been proposed. You know, I think we can't overstate how difficult it is to change the mindset of, hey, this is the way it's always been. I can only accept this if this is zoned as an R1A neighborhood or an R4C neighborhood. We have to be more willing to, if we're going to tackle this problem, we have to be more flexible in the way that we think as a community.
Okay, this question. Go ahead.
So I've been thinking, you know, that you were saying that there's a lot of seniors that are only living on their first floor. Is there some kind of collaboration that say Avalon could go to this person and say, hey, you know, let's renovate your home. You can have the first floor. We can have another person renting the top portion. Have 2 residents, and just like where I'm living right now, where there's all ages in my home and in one home, but just kind of collaborate where we're getting multi-uses out of these people's homes, and they can get a tax break and so on and so forth. Is there such a kind of a...
I can pick up a little bit on Linda, on your question, which is not Avalon doing it necessarily. We haven't given that, no, I know. Haven't given much thought, but naming another local nonprofit called the Housing Bureau for Seniors, which hasn't done exactly what you're talking about, which is figured out the financing for people to reconfigure their house, but rather they've, for a number of years, had, I think, a fairly successful program of matching seniors with people who need housing, and in exchange for living in someone's house at reduced rent, they get reduced rent. They also provide some level of, whether it's support or safety or taking out the garbage, whatever it is that that senior is looking for to help them stay more safely in their home. So that's that kind of partnership, and it does happen. It's very hard to do because now you're asking 2 people who aren't a household to share space, and so it's not easy.
And if you're not sharing space in that way, you're talking about dividing a house into a duplex, which goes against local zoning again.
You converted your upstairs to an ADU. Wouldn't that be allowed under the current ordinance?
Yes-ish. So there were changes about 2 years ago, so you could split your house into 2 if you met the lot requirements as designed. If you're in the right zoning district, you have to do a separate entrance, not in the on the side or the back. And there's a parking space. There's a few other things that are required. So you could, under the current zoning as it was changed a few years back, apply to do so. After those changes, we were so excited, and as Chip mentioned, we had some applications and then none have been built. And so since then, there's another batch of amendments that are, I think, through the Planning Commission and going to council sometime probably in June-ish, most likely July. And so it reduces some of the other requirements. There was a requirement that you had to have an existing garage as of 16 or 15. That's been removed. It could be a single family in any zoning district. It doesn't have to be specifically R1. That lot requirement, the fact that it would have to be smaller than the main house, some of those other details have been removed to take off some of those details. And then what I can't wait to see, to your point, is now will we be able to see some activity? The banks will get more engaged. When we first started making those zoning changes, we were talking to the banks and they're like, yeah, we're gonna start looking at it. But then they didn't really get any calls. So it'll be kind of a process, as Chip mentioned. If those changes are amended, then we're gonna kind of see if there's a shift again. But it would open up a lot of details. But you should call the planning department right now and see if you can qualify to do your or your basement or an attached.
But they're currently not allowing detached accessory dwellings, is that correct?
If you have an existing garage as of that date in there of 2015, I think it's December 31st, 2015, you can, yes. In the certain district, in the lot sizes and the things, yes.
Provided you have a separate sewer line, sewer connection, water.
I think
No,
they
we
changed
do
that
have
now, you
sewer.
can connect to the mainline sewer, but you do have to be the owner occupant of one or the other, either the ADU or the main unit, so you do have to have an owner occupant as part of that property, living on the property.
No, it was answered.
Yes.
So I just want to say something to this. Again, my name is Jessica Lita, and some of you know me as that lady who never shuts up about housing. The reason for that is I love buildings, right? Like, I just think buildings are super interesting. I think they are neighbors in our neighborhood. And what they're used for is as important, probably more important than how they look. And when you look closely at Ann Arbor's buildings, who they don't serve are small business owners and people who didn't buy into Ann Arbor at just the right time, or don't have the right affluence to buy in or rent in right now. And so that's part of the reason that I'm so, I think, anxious on the subject of housing, because we don't have it. And the comment that I wanted to make is that we've heard a lot of, possibilities. We've heard about developing on public land. We've heard about height. We've heard about students. We've heard about ADUs. There's always a reason not to do something, but one of the things that every single person on this panel has said is that we have a crisis. So I think what I'd like to ask is, can we go all in on something? Not everybody, right? Like, we're Ann Arbor, we're super opinionated, we're never gonna be, all on the same page about a single thing. But can we pick an aspect of housing for us, for ourselves, that's meaningful, that feels consistent with how we think about and want to think about Ann Arbor, and support that to the ground so that we are more welcoming to more people? That's all I wanted to say.
I mean, I think, one of our panelists said that earlier, once it hits a crisis moment, that's when we see, government respond. That's when we see policy change. And, it takes a crisis for things to change. And I think that's something to take away from this. I mean, we have just recently approved, $880,000 to go into affordable housing. That's a big step. And we have an RFP for the Y lot, and there's a lot of consensus that is how that should be built. So I think, we're gelling. We could use some help at the state level, the Headley Amendment, Prop 8. When, like Chip says, when you're knocking doors, you realize how mismanaged our housing stock is. When someone's living in a 4,000 square foot house by themselves because they can't leave because of the tax issue. So we're getting to that point where we're going to see major policy changes.
I've heard that, that Arrowwood is a very popular neighborhood. I've had friends who continue to live there and won't move because they love it. It's not high rise. Is there a possibility of doing something like that on a smaller scale on some of these public lots, so it's interwoven with our downtown and the other neighborhoods?
If you look at the size of these lots, they're smaller than this library. So yes, you could put 3 co-ops, apartments there. I mean, it doesn't make any sense for a downtown lot to not have high density, have a lot of people that are living there. It doesn't make any sense to do a low density in a downtown area.
Even D2?
D2 is a moderate
It's
density?
still downtown.
Yeah, it's downtown zoning, moderate, sort of transitional.
But there's different levels of density, and if you look at the way that American cities classically built apartment buildings, Detroit, Brooklyn, Chicago, in the early part of the 20th century, they were 3, 4-story buildings, considerably denser than what we've got throughout most Ann Arbor neighborhoods, but they aren't the 10, 15-story high-rises. So you get considerably...
Steve, this is a great point. I went to college in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the Twin Cities are a great example of exactly that, this higher density woven very comfortably into the fabric of an otherwise single-family neighborhood. It's all about the form of the building. We obsess in this city about how tall is it, what is the net density number, and it has to be this or that. What to me is important is, what does it look like as you experience the street? What does it feel like if you live next door to it? A 3-story building in a neighborhood can be done in a great way that it fits right in, and it can also be done incredibly poorly so that you're stuck with that for generations. We've never addressed that as a community, how to do that. I'm hopeful that our master plan update begins to identify neighborhood character districts and what are those elements that need to come forth in building proposals, and how can we take that idea and increase density, create some of that housing type that's not there. Because I will tell you that that's the weirdest thing about Ann Arbor, is that we don't have that mid-rise, we don't have that missing middle type of housing development.
I just think like right now, we got a lot of challenges, and one of them is, obviously you said before, Chip, that all the low-hanging fruit is gone, all the land that's easy to develop has been developed, and these buildings that you talk about were built 120 years ago, and we're at a point right now where construction costs peter out. I don't know if you've seen them this high before, and you're talking about building in downtown Ann Arbor, which has got natural features challenges to it as well. So just to throw that out there to let people know that the cost of building is extremely high now, and the land that we have in downtown is challenging to build on, and those are some realities.
So we have some questions from the audience.
All right, we have a
Did he answer your question? Okay. You have a question right here?
Oh, I'm just a recent resident in Ann Arbor, and I've been listening to the conversation, and I agree with, just want to underline what the one lady was saying about the conversation about, the vision, what we see, and I think you're on the right track about there's no analysis of power and who is blocking this and how is it being blocked. I was an organizer in Cass Corridor, and organizing tenants unions against the development, and guess who won? Comerica Park, right. Kind of thing. So, so there has to be some kind of, like, master plan. I remember running into that all the time when we wanted to do something. We wanted to organize a whole neighborhood into a co-op. And, that was like, no, and that's not in our master plan. But what forces are really influencing the master plan? Can anybody tell us, who's behind that? Who's involved in it? Us. All of us.
Us. I think ultimately what you look for is to have an inclusive community conversation. So often our conversation at the council table is driven by the people that show up, who are largely homeowners. That the city is over half renters. That is typically a group of people we don't hear from a lot. We certainly rarely hear from students and issues there. But single-family homeowners are very well represented at council. And some of this is, having a discussion in a way that gets to the people that don't normally participate in our discussions. There are lots of people that have time to come to lots of meetings. There are also people that have families and jobs and other requirements that can't carve out 2 hours to come brainstorm. We have to figure out a way to get those voices into the conversation. If we want a master plan that's really representative of everybody that lives here, which I honestly believe that everybody does want that.
And people who can't live here, actually.
Well, yeah, right. I mean, people that work here, people that, it has to be, we talk about updating the master plan, like, oh, this is a simple thing, it'll take a year, 18 months. This is a really hard job. I mean, I'm an urban planner. I wouldn't touch this job with a 10-foot pole. You couldn't pay me $1 million to lead this master planning effort. Like, it's going to be really, really challenging. Like, there's going to have to be a lot of creativity in how do we get people to effectively participate and show that we're listening to what we're hearing. Because we've done lots of planning in this town where, you know, it's either the same people that show up and, you know, or we don't listen to what we hear. And we don't talk about, hey, this is what we heard. The reason we went a different way is X, Y, or Z. There's often great rationale for doing that, but we don't address it that way. I think it's very, very important to figure out how to have a broad community discussion. And frankly, we suck at it. We're really bad at this, but nobody's good at this. This is a really challenging thing to do when on a night like tonight, I could have been at my daughter's soccer practice. You know, I could look to, you know, Jared in the back of the room could have been home watching Game of Thrones, you know. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that competes for our interest. And master planning is so abstract, and we're talking about stuff that, you know, is probably not going to be realized in a lot of our lifetimes.
So we just have a couple more minutes before it's time to go. A couple more questions. Just go ahead.
Really quick to your point about people who come, I very rarely come to something like this. And I came because I wanted to understand the problem better. And yeah, I've been here a long time, longer than it was supposed to be. I do feel like I learned something, but watching the video at home, I don't have 2.5 hours to watch the video at home either.
Right.
So I'm just curious if we could, for example, is this going to be online somewhere where I could actually read the slides? And or could summaries of this type of events be more publicly available? Because I could read pretty fast, and I want to understand and I want to help, but I don't have 2.5 hours to watch the rerun either.
Sure.
I'm just curious if that's just my suggestion about one way more people could be participating if there was a, you know, highlights, quick summary of it widely available.
I can add a question. Oh, so I'm happy to make the presentation available. I can send it to Steven or you or whoever that can distribute it. We do have a plan in the next 6 to 8 months, though, to put together a central resource toolbox around affordable housing issues that we're working on right now. It's not ready to launch, and we're going to have a series of public events that are going to be recorded that people can download, as well as demographics and all this kinds of data stuff. It's just not ready yet, but that is something that we are working on right now.
So just to be clear, my comment was more general, like any town hall, any board meeting.
Only housing.
I mean, I try
I'm in charge of Ward 5, so. But that's a good point. We have a question here.
First, thank you. This has been very valuable. I think on average, I'm a little more tuned into city things than the average person, but I've learned a tremendous amount. There's a lot of nuance here. I knew this was complicated. Chip, you said it right at the beginning. If we had an easy solution, we would have had it years ago. Just a comment that hasn't been touched on. This town, for 40 or 50 years and probably much further back, but we've acted on our values, and we're preserving streetscapes, we're preserving neighborhoods. We have 14 historic districts in this town, protecting 1,800 structures. That's a big factor in what's available, but that's a value we have. And Peter, God bless that student. And I think I heard you said that was not approved. That set of boxes went up 25 stories. And I drink a lot of historic preservation Kool-Aid. I have to admit that. But God, we've got to preserve the character of this town, and at the same time meeting these other issues. To me, 8 or 10 stories, maybe even a little higher, well designed, looks good, pleasing to the eye, meets all the issues, is much more palatable. The building, I can't ever think of it, where that first parking structure was built years and years ago at First and Washington. I keep hoping they're going to take the wrapping off that building, but I'm afraid that's what we've got. We've got to be able to design better than that. And there we had some control, I think. I don't know, but I'm done preaching.
Thank you. Okay, so if there's no other questions for the panel, we will put together, are there any other questions? Yes, one more question.
With that kind of building up and larger, like 25-story building, would that not factor into affordability? Because if you have just economies of scale, when you build more units, it becomes cheaper. If we want to stay with low-rise, 3-story buildings in our central downtown densest areas, isn't that going to be a factor in raising the cost of construction of the building?
There's no question that more density gets you some benefits. But as Frank points out, it's got to be great design. And we built a lot of big buildings the last 5 years that a lot of people complain about or say they all look the same. And there's some truth to that. So Ann Arbor to grow is going to have a hard time growing sideways. It's going to have a very debatable time growing up. But in the long term, I think we've got to add more density. It also feeds the sustainability argument. It also makes the transportation issues a little more solvable. But it's got to be with great design. And we have not had great design in a lot of these buildings.
If I could add also, there's been discussion about a quote RFP for the Y lot. It's a RFP for a community engagement process. It's not an RFP for a development. And the first thing we want to do is try to figure out how do we talk to more people about what they would like to see design-wise, density, massing, uses, what's the cost going to be, and look at all different kinds of options. So in the next couple of months, that will begin to be rolled out, and we're trying not to make it just a come to a meeting like this type of community engagement, but looking at alternative media, looking at alternative ways of engaging people and seeing what's acceptable. That's what that RFP is.
Okay. All right, so I just want to end with first off saying thank you guys for staying this long. We so appreciate it. And thank you guys too for being here with us today.